Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to have you all here this morning, and our friends online as well. Sometimes we'll have a chance to see them also, especially during the questioning, and also questions can be left for Ravi in the chat, which always is helpful as well. Most of you are very familiar with the Theosophical Society, and also many of you familiar with Crotona. We are a residential center. We have about 30 people, including a few children with us, and together we attend to all of the Crotona Institute's needs, staffing and grounds and otherwise. We also are closely allied with the Theosophical Society worldwide that's centered in the south of India in Chennai, and also with the American section that has its headquarters in Wheaton, Illinois. The objects of the Society worldwide are the same. And although we're a separate nonprofit here in the Ojai Valley and institute all on our own, we have close ties with the Society throughout the world. The first object is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity. This is major. It really suggests that we're connected with all forms of life everywhere, and especially embedded in humanity. So humanity actually is our first concern. Although we may be involved in helping other kingdoms of nature and working with them and advocating for them, what we do together as a humanity is critical, especially in times like this, when we can be together looking into things more deeply. We encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. Ravi will bring all of that synthesis together for us these 3 weeks, as usual. And we also investigate what we call the hidden laws of nature and the powers that are latent in humanity. Those powers are interesting and subtle, and will also be discussed as we move through these 3 weeks. But mostly they have our ability to look into ourselves, and as Ravi reminds us so often, to ask, who am I? Who are we? And why are we here together? So together we will explore all of these without imposing anything on you, but welcoming all that you have to give and all that you have brought from your own really vast experience to our time together. Ravi also, as most of you know, is Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He taught in the departments, it is amazing, the departments of physics, philosophy, and science. And it gave her again, this need for synthesis in all of them he can bring. He also teaches internationally now, not only in person and online. He just finished in January teaching for the School of the Wisdom at our international headquarters in Chennai, and teaching actually the same course. And we do this because we know that he tailors these courses, all of them, to audiences both East and West. That's the beauty of a teacher such as Ravi, who can go more deeply into things and also tailor them to whomever he happens to be with. He's an author also, as you know, Pilgrim's Soul, Bhagavad Gita, Gospel of John, In the Light of Indian Mysticism, many, all weaving together Eastern and Western points of view. I wanted to read you just a little from his autobiography, which was published by the Theosophical Society last year. And I really like this first testimony by David Lorimer, who's chair of the Galileo Commission, which I'm not familiar with, but it sounds excellent. And he's program director for the Scientific and Medical Network. He says, to answer his lifelong quest of who am I, Ravi Ravindra has written one of the great spiritual autobiographies of our time. Readers are invited to a corresponding journey within themselves, to live a truly authentic life that makes a small contribution to the evolution of consciousness and life energy. To fall short in this task is to waste the precious gift of a human life. Ravi, loved having him here.
Oldest text in any Indo-European language is the Rig Veda. And the reason I am pointing this particular verse here is to point out that this question of who am I or what am I has been of universal concern to all serious people. I know not whether I am the same as this cosmos, a mystery am I, yet burdened by my mind I wonder. And similarly, we have in another context, this is one of the Psalms. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Whenever, now in a way in this particular psalm there is not a reference to galaxies, etc. But since then we have had even more and more awareness of the largeness of the universe. Now we have 2 trillion galaxies. And to imagine that our planet Earth is the center of that will be totally crazy. We are in a very ordinary galaxy, and even there, around a star which is not at the center of the galaxy, it's just a peripheral star. And we are just a planet around that star. So to imagine that this planet is the center of the universe, and therefore you and I are the center of the universe, would be absolutely crazy. So look at this for a moment. And then the suggestion by all the sages throughout human history is that the whole universe is pervaded by cosmic intelligence. Of course, the labels vary, called Allah or God or Brahma or that or Absolute, many other labels. But not to worry about that, but the suggestion is that the fundamental quality of that, whatever name we attach to that, I will just for simplicity use the word God, is consciousness, highest level of consciousness. And then the suggestion is that the whole universe, as I manifested universe, is by involution, by which one means it's going from the highest level to lower and lower level. So even the rocks and the animals and the trees, human beings, they're all created by this cosmic intelligence. The reason I mention this here, those of you who are, maybe everybody here is aware of the scientific presumption about the universe, there the ultimate reality is matter without any consciousness. So from the spiritual perspective, it's completely the opposite perspective, that the fundamental reality is consciousness, and then of course it is manifested at different levels. That is obviously. And then the suggestion is that each level is actually wishing to evolve, to return to the source. I probably will go into this a little bit more in detail later on. But essentially, these are the 2 great mysteries which have always occupied every human being. I have also given their Sanskrit words here, but basically, I and the cosmos. Why have these intelligent and conscious energies taken the trouble to create me? What am I? Why am I here? In the whole of the Indian tradition, this expression koham, which is usually translated as who am I, is regarded as the seed question for any inquiry. Sanskrit expression is bij prashna, seed question. And then maybe it'll be helpful for me to remind from the perspective, this is from the Bhagavad Gita, remark of Krishna, an eternal portion of myself becomes the creature, jiva, in the world of jivas, and works upon the five senses as well as the sixth one, the manas, here, which are in nature. Two remarks to be made here, that it is a spiritual element that is in you, in me, in every creature. Krishna calls it a portion of myself. Secondly, here, ordinary mind, which in Sanskrit is manas, is more or less regarded as just a follower of the senses. In fact, Krishna more than once in the Bhagavad Gita includes manas among the senses. Whatever the body requires, usually driven by fear and desire, so the ordinary mind will just follow it. Which is why very strong emphasis on cultivating a different quality of mind. The Sanskrit word for that is buddhi. We had exactly the same situation actually in Greek literature. Dianoia was the ordinary mind and nous was the extraordinary mind, or higher quality of mind. But gradually these things get shifted. By the time we come to the English language, we just use one word, mind. It doesn't convey the richness. In fact, buddhi will be something like what Krishnamurti might possibly call intelligence beyond thought. The reason I'm saying this, that here, obviously, as you can see, Krishna includes manas just more or less among the senses. And then we all have a tendency to say, I am breathing as if I created this breathing apparatus. I won't have the foggiest idea how to even create my nails. To imagine creating this breathing apparatus and the air that I need to remain alive. The Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Very strong suggestion, and I invite you to seriously consider this. As long as this character Ravi is alive in this body-mind, it's actually the breath of God that is keeping him alive. It's not my breath. And whenever that other breath leaves, so-called Ravi will die. It is important to be aware. To say that I am breathing is completely an erroneous expression. I am being breathed and being kept alive for a few decades by the breath of God. The reason I remind some of these things, because if we take them seriously, then one is not so occupied just with me, me, me. One realizes there are very subtle conscious energies that are running the whole cosmos, including my body, including my whatever I might call mine. I usually would just simply use the word body, but it includes body and mind. And for simplicity, just one word. And so, eternal wisdom is not Eastern or Western, not Hindu or Christian. The wisest and the most sensitive people everywhere have searched for what is real. Eternal wisdom is transnational, trans-religious, and transcultural. Of course, their expressions vary. Some dance, some write poetry, some make sculpture, some do philosophy, and some do physics. Each expression has its grandeur and its limitations. Every tradition, or at least all the great sages, would agree that no description coming from any kind of form, whether it is through dance, through sculpture, painting, poetry, music, can capture the highest reality. They can hint at it, they can point towards it, but none of them can capture it. And a good reminder from Albert Einstein, hardly a negligible scientist. Human beings, vegetables, or cosmic dust. We all dance to a mysterious tune intoned in the distance by an invisible piper. Not to fantasize that one knows all this. Now, even though all the sages insist that the highest reality cannot be described, for example, the Buddha refused to describe what nirvana is. When Christ was asked to describe the kingdom of God, he says it's a mustard seed. Now, if you feel clear about it now, please let me know. So, nevertheless, because their pupils are often keep asking them something, so they hint at certain features or certain characteristics, and I will speak about them a little bit. These are some of the expressions that get used. Satyam Ritam Brahat, this is coming from the Rig Veda, truth, order, vastness. The next one is also from the Rig Veda, light, eternal life, love. By the time of the Upanishads, which is a little later, the last line is actually from the Upanishad. Sat Chit Anand, truth, consciousness, delight. I was particularly struck. Somehow, actually in the Abrahamic tradition, I have never come across anybody describing God as delight, as joy. Sri Aurobindo, in one of his remarks, which has especially struck me, says, delight created the universe for delight. But let me continue a little bit here. These are other expressions which are frequently used, omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, but people often don't realize omniamorosus. So I am inviting you to think about this. All loving, also all delightful, omnidelectabilis. Truth, love, beauty, these are some of the other expressions that get used. But you know, every religious person tends to say that God is omnipresent. I then invite them, if it is even remotely true, God is right here, in front of us, behind us, inside us. Everything that we do or think, feel, is under the gaze of God. Unless we just are using these expressions, just a good idea, and they don't mean anything. Just stay with this one expression. God is omnipresent. If it is remotely true, he, she, it, whatever label we attach to God, is right here. And everything I say now, or feel or think, is under his gaze. Similarly, all of these other expressions have very similar kind of call to us. And again, another thing that I wanted to just draw your attention. Here's a remark in the first letter of John. Whoever is without love does not know God, for God is love. Repeats again, God is love, and whoever remains in love remains in God, and God in him. He's not saying God is loving. That is also entirely possible. In fact, my previous slide showed that as a possibility. But to say God is love is to say the very structure of God is love. And anybody who is connected with God, for example, if Christ is truly saying the Father and I are one, then love oozes out of him. To imagine that the Buddha was enlightened but was not compassionate will be an oxymoron. Compassion, love, sense of unity, sense of oneness, sense of service oozes out of the very people who are in any sense connected with God. It's not that they decide to be loving. In fact, this was something very much emphasized by Krishnamurti, perhaps more than anybody else. Some of you may even know this story. This is actually not in my own personal dialogue with him. It was Laura Huxley, Aldous Huxley's second wife, and on one occasion they were gathered there, and Krishnamurti was there, 6 or 7 people. And they were all describing that they're going around the world doing good. And Krishnamurti said to them, "You shouldn't be doing good." They were quite surprised. They said, "But you're going around the world doing good." He said, "Not intentionally." For him, if you have goodness in you, it will ooze out of you. If you decide to do good, there is always some sort of a result is expected, something coming from your own enhancement of your achievement or enhancement or getting better place in heaven. So it always remains selfish. Krishnamurti very strongly actually emphasized. In fact, on one occasion, he used this example: a rose does not decide to smell like a rose. We recognize the rose from its fragrance. It doesn't decide to smell like a rose. So a good person doesn't decide to be good. Goodness emerges out of them. So certainly you read almost any remarks of Christ have the word love in it. In fact, I don't know any other religious literature which has that kind of concentration of the phrase love in them. Similarly, other expressions like truth or beauty. In fact, there is a story about one of the favorite disciples of the Buddha, Ananda, on one occasion was very struck by something very beautiful. And he said to the Buddha, "Tathagat, it seems to me that the beauty is next to spirituality." The Buddha said, no, beauty is spirituality. So, very strong emphasis on truth, love, beauty, delight, consciousness. These are some of the standard expressions that get used. Then, maybe I mentioned Ravindra's remark here already here. Then a very strong suggestion, in fact even in the contemporary scientific perspective that is now accepted, that the whole external universe is mirrored inside us. Using slightly scientific terminology, it will be like each one of us is a hologram of the whole universe. But of course, the call, just as a kind of really a footnote here to say, starting from the 1600 almost, slightly before that, very strong emphasis from the scientific side, not simply to accept what is theoretically being said or said by somebody, even the greatest sages, let us say what is said in the Bible, but also to see what we can measure or observe. But it was mostly the religious people who ostracized the scientific perspective, not the scientific people. These days it may be the other way around, but Giordano Bruno came up with the idea which these days we would call exoplanets. That's not the expression he used, but just thinking other planet. He was burnt at the stake because that would mean there are other planets, so Christ would have to be there also. He has to be born again, which is against the idea of the Bible. Descartes was poisoned by a Catholic priest. Galileo was incarcerated. Kepler's mother was tried as a witchcraft, so as a witch. So he had to leave. You look at any of the great scientists, I've just mentioned to you 4 or 5 of them, they were all ostracized or killed in one way or the other by the religious people, not coming from the scientific side. So that horror that was created really very much has resulted in a scientific measurements then become essentially occupied with external measurements. All scientific perceptions, measurements, recordings are externally oriented. Whereas from all the spiritual sages, look within, that is the call, again and again and again. Internal universe. So you see the separation, how it has taken place. Not created by science, but mostly by religious people. Sadly, at least in my judgment, religions have created more damage to spiritual search than anybody else or any other institution. More organized the religion, more damage it has created. Fortunately, Hinduism is least organized religion. Maybe therefore it hasn't created. So it can allow people like Raman or Aurobindo or Vivekananda or Krishnamurti to still survive. But returning nevertheless to the idea that in principle the whole external cosmos is mirrored inside us, but to be able to see, we need an appropriate instrument. This is true anywhere. And so eyes of the flesh see the things of the flesh. This is St. Paul. He actually speaks of the mind dealing with the things of mind, flesh, etc. So I'm just slightly paraphrasing it. That's why I've just given you a reference there. Then really the question naturally arises for any serious searchers. Obviously, I did not create myself. Why have I been created? And also because religious traditions have used words like spirit and soul in whatever suits them. So here is a remark actually of my own teacher, Jean de Salzman, not using the word soul, but slightly differently. First of all, just to read this here, obviously I did not create myself. A particle of divinity or the breath of God, what is keeping me alive. The fundamental characteristic of this self are love, truth, and joy. We cannot be fully ourselves until we give expression to that self which is quite different from my usual worldly self. Which is why, at least in the English language, we have the facility to have a capital S self and a small s self. We don't have this privilege in Devanagari script. There it has to be understood in the context. Devanagari script is the script used for Sanskrit or Hindi writing. And then a constant reminder from my own teacher, Jean de Salzman, you don't love yourself enough, this self that wishes and needs to emerge. But very strong suggestion that each level of reality wishes to evolve in order to return to the source. Here I give you this remark of St. Augustine. Our soul cannot be at rest until it is stayed in God. In fact, that is the only characteristic of the soul, namely wishing to evolve. So I'm asking you, ask yourself impartially. I have to ask myself also impartially. Do I have a soul? It's nice to say that. Every religion just ends up saying it. Every religion says in one way or the other that the death of the body is not the death of the person. always the implication is that the person is other than the body. And then it usually gets identified either with or soul or spirit. Again here, especially I say this for my friends from the Christian background, it may be helpful. Especially since the 16th century, especially after the writings of Descartes, but before that, even a few centuries earlier by Saint Benedict, the words spirit and soul have been mixed up. In the New Testament, every book was initially written in Greek. The word which is translated as spirit is pneuma, and the word which is translated as soul, in English we would say psyche, but it's psyche, it is said in Greek. So pneuma and psyche. And another reminder here, in all the ancient languages, at least to the extent that I have been able to ask my scholarly friends, certainly in Sanskrit, in Chinese, in Arabic, in Greek, the word for breath and for spirit are either exactly the same or they are intimately connected with each other. So the spirit enters into me, into every creature, into the whole universe as the breath of God. So that is the way it gets represented. So, but what has happened, especially since Descartes, particularly in the 16th century, he wrote a book in which he ends up equating spirit with soul with mind, if you would believe it. And since then, most of my Christian friends think they both mean the same thing, spirit and soul. Soul is personal. Your soul is different from my soul. Spirit is transpersonal. And the call from a spiritual point of view is that each one of us would assist the evolution of our soul, which has a certain particle of divinity in it, to rise to the transpersonal level of the spirit. Ultimately, of course, back to God. That's the call. The call in all serious teachings is to come to oneness with the divine. My own personal impression is that perhaps in the whole human history, maybe no more than a dozen people have actually come to that. Of course, many of them may have come to it. They are not being recorded unless somehow somebody gets organized a religion around them and therefore makes completely dysfunctional everything. So there may be more people, that I don't know. However, it will be a very large project to come to that level. But that is the call overall. The reason why this particle of divinity has taken on my body, has created me, so that my body and mind can undertake the appropriate action in order to assist the evolution of this particle of divinity. In fact, a remark of, maybe I do actually have, I perhaps quote here in one of the slides here. Ishwar Krishna, he is author of Sankhya Karika. Sankhya is another school of philosophy in India, like yoga is one school, Vedanta, etc. And in fact, most of the philosophic background in the Bhagavad Gita is from Sankhya. So, Ishwar Krishna is the author of Sankhya Karika. This is his remark. Spirit without the body is lame, and body without the spirit is blind. Spirit cannot act without the body, cannot evolve without the actions of the body. I use the word body, but it includes the mind. On the other hand, the body without the spirit is blind, does not know what is the right thing to do. But it is important to keep this in mind. There is a bit of a tendency to imagine that somehow my body has got a soul. No, strictly speaking, from a spiritual point of view, it's the soul that has taken on the body. It's not that the body has somehow acquired a soul. And the death of the body is not the death of the soul. this is rather slightly ironic here, because as far as I have checked, in all Indian languages, when the person dies, it is said he has sharir tyag, meaning has left the body. But in English, ironically, we say he has given up the ghost, as if he is basically the body, but somehow has given up the spirit. Isn't it ironic? Completely contrary to what the sages in the whole Judeo-Christian tradition would say. But there we are. Has given up the soul. We use the word given up the ghost. But do keep this in mind. This is an important distinction that I'm trying to make. It's not that the body has the soul. It's the soul that has the body as its instrument. And this is another reason to keep reminding people there is no reason to be against the instrument. Sometimes in some esoteric may be the wrong word, some particularly strong practitioners from yoga or elsewhere, they say you can forget about the body. That is completely silly. Body is meant to be the instrument to assist the evolution of the soul. There is no reason to be against the body or the mind. But actually it is important to keep the instrument tuned, refreshed, sharpened, which is why if anybody who's read the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali has absolutely nothing against maintaining the healthy body, so emphasis on the asanas and the pranayamas, etc., etc. But he's not wholly occupied with this, not trying to make athletic body. I'm always rather saddened. Actually, you can look it up. Any of the people who have won great races, hardly any of them lives past the age of 60. They are using their body to accomplish something, but in the process the body degenerates. So it is silly in any sense to be against the body, but the body needs to be maintained, well kept, so that it can actually assist the evolution of the spirit. Maybe before that, first of all, let me just come back to this here. Okay, here is a remark again of my teacher, Jean de Salme. She uses the word energy rather than using spirit or soul, etc. here. An energy which is trying to evolve. That is why it comes into a body. If a person works, which is essentially the Gurdjieffian terminology for undertaking any spiritual practice, if a person undertakes any practice, helps the evolution of this energy, at death this energy goes to a higher level. If one does not work, the energy returns to its own level, but the human life is wasted. Because that is said to be the whole purpose of being created. And so the call is, here I give you several references. In all spiritual traditions, God or Brahma or truth is totaliter or aliter, wholly other. No description or expression, whether in philosophy, theology, music or art, can capture it. The Upanishads repeatedly say, neti, neti, not this, not this. Any description. For the great sages, the wholly other is intimately myself, on the other hand. Look within, you are the Buddha. This is the remark of the Buddha. I am Brahma, Yajnavalkya. The Father and I are one, Christ in John. And Christ came not to make us Christians, but to make us Christ. This is paraphrased from the Gospel of Philip. Naturally non-canonical. It doesn't suit the churches. Aldous Huxley had written quite an important book called Perennial Philosophy, and he has 4 makes a summary of it, 4 particular items that belong to the whole perennial philosophy. By the way, he hardly quotes any philosophers. He's mostly quoting people who actually experience something directly. Philosophers are more interested in winning arguments. So this is his remark, not mine. At the core of the perennial philosophy, we find 4 fundamental doctrines. I'm simply quoting the 4th one here. Man's life on earth has only one end and purpose: to identify himself with his eternal self, and so to come to unitive knowledge of the divine ground. Now, it's an expression not usually used by the sages. They would use it slightly differently, or Christ would say, the Father and I are one, or Yajnavalkya might say, Aham Brahma, etc., etc. So, but very similar kind of conclusion brought by Aldous Huxley in his book. Then, simple reminder, the aim of any spiritual practice is not freedom for myself, but freedom from myself. That requires sacrificing my complete occupation with me, my mine. All this is much easier to say than to actually do in practice. But this is nevertheless the call. Why should it be easy? Then I can become an instrument of the divine will, oozing out love which resides deep down in my heart, mind and body, but usually I'm not aware of it. That's the suggestion. And a great Greek philosopher, actually my most favorite Greek philosopher, Plotinus, makes this remark: our soul is amphibious in nature. It can sink completely into matter, or it can soar into the one. Its whole purpose of taking on the body is to try to soar into the one, but it can get completely occupied with the body and therefore sink into the matter. This forgetfulness is deeply seated in all of us. And this is the reason why some of you have seen, maybe I have a picture here, image of Shiva dances on the demon of forgetfulness. The Sanskrit word is apasmar, forgetfulness. Often in South India, it gets as demon of illusion, muhyalaka. Then, again and again, a distinction made that there are really 2 in us, in each one. Different expressions get used. So here I'm intentionally giving several different expressions. St. Paul refers to that as spiritual nature and carnal nature. In the Bhagavad Gita, very strong expression, angelic nature and demonic nature. John the Salesman calls them angelic nature and animal nature. Often in writing, we simply say self and capital S self and a small s self, or even I and me. That kind of distinction gets made sometimes. But nevertheless, a reminder again and again that unless I begin to even see that there are 2 energies in me, 2 coming from 2 different directions, one from the spiritual side, one from the material side. And the question really is, how do I reconcile or bring into proper work the 2 energies? Sometimes a very strong emphasis in some very practices, as if one can just forget completely the material side, forget the body, the mind. which in my judgment is completely silly, because that is meant to be the very instrument to assist the evolution of the spiritual side. But it's good for us to see what are their main features, and then to see if those apply to me, each one of us. I'm using here the expression I and me, but one could use I have just given there. It could be self or spirit or ego on the other side, or flesh or body, mind, whatever. What are their main features? The capital S self or I has to do with meaning, search for truth, love, beauty, and it is expressed in compassion, awareness, and sense of service and sense of unity. Me has to do with fear, desire, gain, loss, survival, continuity, reward, punishment, exclusivity, approval, disapproval, knowledge, ignorance. To begin to see both of them in me is a starting point. It's not that I am wholly occupied just with one or the other, but much of the time one is occupied with the lower self. So then this is the question when we say what am I or who am I, this question then arises again slightly differently. If there are two in each one of us, I and me, then the question is, am I the I coming from above and which does not die when the me, which is the body-mind, dies? Or am I the me, which is wholly occupied with wholly vanish when the body dies? It is very important for us to understand the strength of the bodily desires and needs. Let me first of all remind you, look at the Bible. No prophet could get to heaven without being tested by the devil, including Christ. Christ is tested by Satan. Prophet Muhammad is tested by devil. So is Abraham. Look at any of them. Similarly, in the Indian tradition, classic example of that, of course, is the Buddha. Before he becomes the Buddha, he is tested by Mara. First of all, let me here remind you that Mara and Satan in Hebrew and Mara in Pali, deep down they both mean exactly the same. Obstacle. Obstacle. What stands in our way. So each human being will be tested. And a classic example, as I just said, is the Buddha. Before he becomes the Buddha, what are the tests? Mara sends his own daughters to seduce him. In fact, even in the Buddhist tradition, this remark is quoted. I don't know whether the Buddha actually said it or not, but you find this in the Buddhist tradition. That if there was one other force as strong as sex, he's not sure he would have made it. I don't know why people get so occupied or upset about sex. None of us will be here without somebody having had sex. So the whole Prakriti, the whole nature exists. So to imagine that this force can be just left outside or can be ignored will be completely crazy. But there is a strong religious kind of mumbo-jumbo about this, trying to emphasize this. But rather than to find its appropriate place. In any case, then Mara says, I will turn this mountain into a mountain of gold. Now ask yourself, how many $1 billion would you need for agreeing to something? Then that doesn't work. Then he says, I will give you sovereignty over the whole world. So pleasure, wealth, power. You can look at your date book or your bank account and see what is running your life. But that doesn't work in the case of Siddhartha Gautama. Then Maharaj sends his armies to kill him. Fear. Which is why in the strongest emphasis in the Buddhist tradition, more than it's expressed everywhere else slightly differently, to be free of fear and desire. Because these are really what is basically running our life. And then if the whole external universe is in principle manifested inside me, why not the devil? He's also part of the universe. He didn't create himself. He was also created by God. In fact, just to remind you, Lucifer was the highest of all angels. Prophet Isaiah describes that he wished to be like the Most High. Therefore, he was expelled. So then we end up having these 3 or 4 different words meaning much the same. Lucifer, Satan, devil, Beelzebub. I think these are usually get meaning the same thing. But it's a very helpful remark from Rumi, actually, a great Sufi sage. If you have not yet seen the devil, go look in the mirror. If it is true that I have been saying several times already, that the whole external universe is mirrored inside me, why not the devil? Why not God? They're both mirrored inside me. But I may not wish to see something, that's a different thing. But until I see it, until I find its appropriate place, I cannot be free of it. But again, I'm simply reminding you, ultimately there is nothing Eastern or Western about reality. Truth or God is not Chinese or American, Hindu or Christian. But the thing is that we are so. Each one of us is very deeply conditioned by our cultural background. Very deeply. So unless I can understand what my cultural or my religious background is somehow making me think in some way or believe in certain way, I can't really be wholly free of it. And that is somehow assisted if I can be aware of another perspective, which is what I keep saying, that we are in a global culture now. Don't need to get wholly occupied with even one's own cultural background. One can look at it more and more impartially and to see if I can be more and more free of it. So this is one common lesson of all scriptures and sages, as far as I can understand. As long as I remain the way I am, I cannot come to truth or real or God. What is needed is a radical transformation of my whole being. And the transformation basically is freedom from myself. Or me, or me, my, mine, whatever way one puts it. Here is an obvious reminder from Christ. Unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. In fact, in the other Gospels, canonical Gospel, it is expressed slightly more strongly. Unless you die to yourself, unless you die to the world. There are varieties of ways of. I have chosen actually the more easily acceptable comment. And then you read this in John's Gospel. The man who loves his self loses it, while the man who hates his self in the world preserves it to eternal life. I'm not sure that I feel personally particularly happy about hating oneself, but finding its right place. To me, that is much more important than. Now, sadly, our time is coming to an end, but I need some more time, so I may take a little bit more time even after the tea break. Partly because I want to discuss some major similarities and major differences in what I classify as two great streams of spirituality. One is, we could call it Western and Eastern, if you like, or Abrahamic and Indian. That may be closer to the truth. Abrahamic includes Judaism, Christianity, Islam. I keep reminding all my Christian friends, Christ was a Jew, and all his disciples, immediate disciples, were Jews. And he actually says, I have come to fulfill the tradition, not to destroy it. So he is very much fulfilling the Jewish tradition. I have to keep reminding to my, later on, of course, for political reasons, there are differences, fights, etc. That happens everywhere. Similarly, in the Indian tradition, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, a great scholar of Buddhism, actually I had a conversation with him, T.R.V. Murthy, he said to me, Buddhism is simply Hinduism for export. Because Hinduism got associated, especially by the Persians, as with the land on the other side of the river Indus. So it became geographically located. So, for example, strictly speaking, if I move away from India, I am no longer a Hindu from that definition. So when Buddhism went, or Hindu teachings went outside, they were no longer called Hinduism. So Buddhism is Hinduism for export. Similarly, other traditions here. So what I'm going to do, maybe we'll do it, if you don't mind, after a little tea break. Would you still allow me about 10, 15 more minutes? Because I think unless we see some major differences in the two teachings, it's hard to realize that one's own perspective is not the only real perspective. So I'll return to this in a little bit here. But basically, these are the two main streams I'll be speaking about. Partly, I keep calling them Western and Eastern, just to remind you. This is especially so in Christianity more than anywhere else. Starting with Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, the religious powers and secular powers got intermixed very much. The Pope could decide who would the emperor be, emperor could decide who the Pope could be. And it was consequently that you look at the whole history of the world from the 16th century onward, every place on the planet is ruled by people from Christian background. Don't take my word for it. You are all aware of this. Every country is controlled or ruled. And right now, USA is claiming to be the overall controller of the world. Why? Are they smarty pants, more intelligent than others? Are they bringing more wisdom? What is happening? Just simply because of this connection of religion and power brought together for centuries. Okay, so if you allow me a few more minutes, really the major difference from which many, many things result is that in India, we don't have a myth of creation. What we have, what I call it, I have never heard this expression used by anybody else, myth of emanation, which basically means Brahma, which is the label for the highest reality. By the way, literally it simply means the largeness or the vastness, endlessness. Annie Besant, because in the English expression vastness usually doesn't seem to carry the meaning of time in it, so she tends to translate this as eternal. So I'm simply reminding you some of the translations of that. So Brahma did not create the world. It, first of all, it is neuter, partly because it's not degenerated enough yet to get identified with one gender or the other. It's not developed enough to be gender. It's the other way around. It emanated the world. Brahma is not only in everything it is everything. A classic illustration of this is actually in the oldest Upanishad, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, that as a spider web oozes out of the substance of the spider, then the spider can move anywhere on the web or even away from the web. So everything oozes out of Brahma, but Brahma is not stuck in the manifested universe. It can move anywhere or even away from it. So that is the illustration given by in the oldest Upanishad. So, but what is the consequence of that is that every level of materiality has a particle of Brahma in it. Even the rocks. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says something very similar in slightly different terminology. Let me use the expression that Krishna uses in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, everything that exists is a combination of the field and the knower of the field, and I am the knower of the field in all fields. So everything that exists has Krishna in it. Similarly, everything that exists has Brahma in it. And the result of that idea is oneness of all there is. Whereas very strong emphasis in the Abrahamic tradition on the uniqueness of all there is. Even in the presence of God, Moses speaks to God as a man to a man. That's the expression. That's not my expression, that's in the Bible. And therefore very much emphasis on the uniqueness of everything, of every creature, of everything. On the other hand, oneness of everything. So you see, very radical difference, and many things follow from that. I will gradually try to, first of all, let me just, if you look at it, in the creation myth, we have various divisions, and nothing can merge from one level to the other. Even the highest angel, Lucifer, cannot become like God. As I mentioned already, if you read, Prophet Isaiah actually describes it, that he wished to be like the Most High, so he's expelled from heaven. And certainly Christ, when he says the Father and I are one, he's crucified. Similarly, in the Islamic tradition, Al-Hallaj said something very similar, he was also crucified. In the whole of the Abrahamic tradition, you can never come across an expression like, which is quite common in the Indian tradition, that his spirit merged into the cosmic spirit. If you ever show it to me, I'll give you a ticket to fly to Halifax. Come and see me. No, because one begins to then see there are many radical differences that result from this. So even in the presence of God, one remains an individual. Even after death, one remains an individual. And individuality is most expressed in each one of us by our body than by anything else. So the body has to be preserved. In the Abrahamic tradition, cremation is forbidden. Burial in the ground is necessary so that the body may be at the end of the world after the second coming of Christ will rise again, but may be permanently in heaven or permanently in hell. But one would remain a unique individual even after death forever and ever and ever, which is completely surprising from the perspective of the whole of the Indian tradition. So some of these things I will go into more details, but I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the major differences which result in, for example, even the difference between why cremation rather than burial. Personally, from my point of view, in a global culture, we need to understand the place of both uniqueness and oneness, and their appropriate place, appropriate location, and not to be so stuck with one or the other idea. but that's a whole different project. And then very strong suggestion about, let me see, I actually, even in my book, Whispers from the Other Shore, I had shown this. Some of you may have seen it, but I never know. Excuse me for a moment. Suddenly some of my files got. You see, you would never see any prophet portrayed in the biblical tradition in the posture of meditation. Always in a posture of prayer. It actually interferes with your breathing. Don't take my word for it, you try it. But that is, and you would not see, it's possible, but everything I say may have exceptions, and I'll be happy to hear about some of those exceptions. But in general, sages in India would be shown in positions of meditation. You look at particularly people like Vivekananda, and it is also true. In effect, it's a very interesting remark actually of St. Paul. One who is connected with the Spirit is beyond the law. So you look at somebody like Raman, who we call Raman Maharishi, which means a great sage, always sitting in a very bad posture as far as I can see. And have some of you seen his photographs of Raman? Yeah. It's hardly like Vivekananda or Ravindra or anybody. Yeah? So it is also possible that one can be free of any of this posture business, but in general, even Raman will hardly ever be shown in a posture of prayer. So I'm inviting you to see many, many things follow from these differences that result. And I'll speak more about it, but if you look at it, hardly ever you would see anybody being mentioned that he was searching for something. It's always God who somehow gets you by the scruff of the neck and says you must do this, and you have no choice, you must do it. Look at Moses, look at Muhammad, look at any of the prophets. Whereas in the Indian tradition, for example, the classical example of that will be Siddhartha Gautama. He's struck by seeing an old man and a sick man and a dead man, and wonders whether he himself will die or his son will die. So he wishes to search for something that never dies when the body dies. So he undertakes a search. And you can similarly read about Aurobindo, you can read about Raman, you can read about Vivekananda. Read any of the sages in India. They begin from searching for something, and only a few of them naturally come to actually being blessed by grace. And that is true for everybody. There may be thousands of physicists, not everybody is going to be at the level of Einstein or Newton. But it's not that there is no search in the Abrahamic tradition, but it's not emphasized, it's not mentioned. If you can tell me about any of the sages about which it is said, oh, they went out, they were searching for this or that, and then they were black, I'll be surprised. And then very much emphasis, you look at any of these things that I mentioned here. Human being is sinful, for example. It's completely surprising from the perspective of the Indian perspective, where it's called, the Rig Veda says, we are Amritasya Putra. We are children of eternal life. That does not mean there is any lack of sin in India, let me assure you. At present, much to my own surprise, 40% of the elected members of parliament in India have criminal records against them. I can hardly believe it myself, but you can check. 40%. These are elected members of parliament of India. So it's not a shortage of sin, but deep down the suggestion is that we are not sinful just by birth, but especially in the Catholic tradition, Roman Catholicism, it gets very strongly emphasized. Just because we are children of Adam and Eve And since Adam had disobeyed the will of God, so therefore he was committing sin, so we automatically become sinful just from the very birth, even if a kid hasn't done anything wrong so far. And similarly, you can see some of the other differences here. I don't want to carry on here. Yeah. You would never in the whole of the Indian tradition know none of the sages or teachers, for example, Krishna or the Buddha or Patanjali, nobody is called a savior. That expression is completely surprising from the Indian perspective. These are teachers bringing you to try something, do something, and if you succeed, then you can come to something. But savior means I need to be saved, I am sinful, etc. So, and certainly, as I have already said, for anybody to rise from one level to another is forbidden. This was the main objection to the theory of evolution of Darwin in 1858, when he came up with this. This was the major obstacle to this, that it is completely contrary to the notion going from one level to another.
Can we ask questions now or make comments, or not yet?
Maybe just a few more minutes and then.
Yeah.
I have just one or two other slides, then I can. Oh, is something wrong at the top there? Now, I especially draw your attention to the very last item here, Shri Anirvan, highly regarded great sage. I was very fortunate to meet him. I'm actually just very fortunate to have met some quite remarkable people. I don't know how, without even realizing. For example, when I first met Krishnamurti, I did not know who he was. And similarly, many other people also, I had no idea who they were. So I had a chance to meet him he was on his deathbed actually, but he agreed to meet me for about half an hour. And when I was leaving, this is what he said: you will know something real when you realize that God is the same as a dog. Now, obviously at any ordinary level, if a dog is trying to bite my child, should I just assume that it is Krishna kind of touching? So clearly, this has meaning only at a certain level, and that's the reason. But if I can come to that sense of the oneness of all, that, as he says, then I will know something real. Now, in my judgment, both oneness and uniqueness are facts of reality. In fact, uniqueness is an aspect of oneness. Duality or trinity does not need to oppose oneness, but they can enhance it when placed in the right order. Diversity in unity. There can be no manifestation without uniqueness. The oneness that the Indian sages speak about is beyond manifestation. Here is an example from the Mundaka Upanishad. Just as the flowing river disappears in ocean, casting off name and shape, even so the knower freed from name and shape attains to the divine person, higher than the high. It's only when one is really free of one's uniqueness or one's individuality that one can come to this sense of unity. I'm suggesting this to you folks if you are interested. These are just suggested exercises. You don't have to necessarily follow it. It's not schoolwork, but if you're interested, do you think your incarnation is accidental? Or do you have a feeling that there is some purpose to your existence? How do you begin to discover it? Do you sometimes sense the two in you, whether you label these as I and me or something else, such as the self and the ego? What distinction do you feel between the two? Then any of you are welcome to send any questions to me if you like, but you can just raise them now here. So, unless there is some particular slide you wish to see again, I think we can forget about the slides now and feel free to bring your own insights or questions.
Ravi, I just have a question. That slide that you had the comparison of the Indian Abrahamic traditions, which of your books is that from?
Whispers from the Other Shore.
Okay.
And the subtitle is Spiritual Search East and West.
My comment or my question, Ravi, has to do with that same slide where you've written the differences.
Should I go back to those
Sure.
slides? Can we go back to the slide? That was at almost the end.
Yes, almost the end. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't need to have the side thing here unless...
We have to change.
Yes?
So, just looking at those two lists, I have an enormous attraction to the Indian tradition. And
That's what happened to the Theosophical Society also overall.
yes. but it was actually quite wonderful. You asked that we wait until you finish, because you more or less you helped answer my objections in the subsequent things that you said about uniqueness. But it just seems that the Judeo-Christian tradition is very dualistic, and the Indian tradition is really calling for an understanding of oneness. So I don't know what my question really is, but maybe my question has to do with a search that I've had for the last little while that has to do with a geography of kind of struggling with the geography of what's going on. For example, if I'm sitting or meditating and we talk about energy coming in from the top of the head, for example, or there's this geometric problem in a way that where is what and where am I, and anyway, you can see that I'm struggling.
I'm not really entirely sure that I quite understand what you're saying, but...
I don't understand my question either. So.
But as I keep reminding again and again, we are very much in a global culture, and if we actually slightly impartially look at history, then we see why so-called Western world, mostly driven underlying Christian religion, has been dominating the world for centuries. And even now, whether it is World Health Organization or any other large international, UNESCO, UNO or whatever, it's all being driven primarily by the Western countries. And even perhaps more uniquely by USA more than the other countries even. Now, but that is partly arising because of the whole emphasis. Let me actually make a remark here. When I say about uniqueness, in general for human beings, the uniqueness is my individuality. And that tends to lead to, therefore, towards more and more individualism. Me, controlling, overcoming everything, etc. Now, if there is a sense of oneness of all there is, then there is not so much a matter of me. On the other hand, one of the consequences of that, as you can, anybody visiting India can see that, often the uniqueness of somebody is much less appreciated. I have a very specific example of this. Somebody, a professor of physics at the Punjab University, had done remarkable work in physics, but somehow nobody was sort of admiring him or sending him for a Nobel Prize or something. He moved to Canada. Within 6 months, he got a Nobel Prize. But the work he had done was mostly in India. He didn't do the work in Canada. But in Canada, it was recognized. There is much more a sense of that kind of uniqueness. So every feature, I often remind people that everything has, actually this is a remark of Gurdjieff, every stick has two ends. Every idea has its negative side as well as a positive side. And one can get too stuck with one thing or the other. So, but my suggestion now is very much to people, particularly being in a global culture, to begin to see the differences are in expressions of reality, not in reality. If you don't mind, I give you an example from history of physics. Very quickly, I'll give you this example. In the 1930s, really a great turmoil in the whole of physics departments everywhere, because something was sometimes behaving like particles, the same thing will sometimes behave like waves. So the crisis was, what the hell, are they waves or are they particles? And it used to be more or less a cliche in the physics laboratories. On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they were particles. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, they were waves. And on Sunday, the Lord rested. Until then, it was proposed by a very well-known physicist, Dirac. I actually had a chance to meet him later on. I actually describe in my book meetings many Nobel Prize winners in physics. Very different qualities of human beings. But in any case, he proposed an overall idea that they are really neither waves nor particles, but this element, when it is in certain kind of experimental setup, it behaves like particles. In another experimental setup, it behaves like waves. So my suggestion now to you is that ultimately reality is neither question of uniqueness or oneness. In some cultural setup, it is said to be uniqueness. In some other cultural setup, oneness. So not to get stuck up with the experimental setup completely. Energy, what is, as I said earlier also, it's the description of reality which is different, not reality. But to acknowledge that reality is actually beyond description. In fact, that is exactly what all the sages have always said. When they, by reality here, supposing they mean, of course, the highest reality, God, it is beyond description. But nevertheless, then we get stuck with description. He is the only begotten Son of God. You know, kids are hardly out of diapers. Then they have to say this, that Christ is the only begotten Son. How the hell do they know this? How do they know any other religious tradition? So we are imposing these things completely culturally. What is required more and more actually a freedom from me, and therefore also my background, my culture, but not to be against it, because each of these cultural backgrounds also have some remarkable contributions to make. So not to be against anything. Even, for example, I keep criticizing the churches. On the other hand, without the great churches, we won't have the great cathedrals, we won't have the frescoes, we won't have great pieces of music. So it is silly to be against the churches. On the other hand, to get stuck with one expression or the other, more and more to recognize that the ultimate is actually indescribable. Nevertheless, each culture, each religion has to somehow find a way of. I occasionally use this metaphor. At the very best, any religion or any culture is a finger pointing to the moon. If you get so stuck to the finger, you'll never get to the moon. But there is no harm about looking at a finger pointing to the moon. But if you see more than one finger pointing to the moon, it can remind you that it is a desirable destination to go there. So that's what. Yes.
Yeah, somewhere, I don't remember where, Plato says that the spirit can only evolve within the body. So, and it's similar to what you're saying, the body is the instrument. But what does that suggest once one leaves the body? Does the spirit remain static until, if you believe that you take on another incarnation?
Well, certainly in the Indian tradition, the spirit is on its path of evolution. This is very much in the Theosophical Society background as well. And that it comes to a certain level, but for it to evolve, it again needs to undertake a body, or where it needs to undertake the appropriate actions so that it can evolve further. Now, what has happened in the Abrahamic tradition, because of this uniqueness, and for any human being really, supposing you look at me or I look at you, your uniqueness or my uniqueness is much more expressed by our body than by anything else, right? Because mental ideas can be commonly shared, etc. But the body is not shared. So, therefore, so much emphasis on preserving the body. That's preserving the uniqueness. And therefore, even after death, somehow the body will rise again, especially get much more emphasized in Christianity, or especially in Catholicism, that with the second coming of Christ, there will be a fight between God and the devil. Devil will be defeated, and so then there will be again another judgment. Initially, in the rise of Christianity, that one was judged immediately after death. But the body remains. That is me. And so I am permanently in heaven or permanently in hell, depending on whatever I deserve. But then the whole notion of purgatory got developed, partly that possibly you might slightly reform yourself, but still there will be judgment at the end of the days. Then you'll be permanently in heaven or permanently in hell. So from that perspective, every member of the mafia who has nice faith in Christ can happily see the Buddha being tortured in hell, right? Because he doesn't believe the same thing. You see what follows from all this?
Yes. But I have trouble thinking, okay, supposing there is such a thing as bliss in heaven, bodiless, just spirit. Does that suggest that just remains always the same? Because there's no five senses, no body, there's no, simply a static state of bliss?
Well, that is the general impression in the Christian tradition. It's not my suggestion.
No.
But what I'm suggesting to you, actually some of you, especially if you actually have a Christian background, it's almost important for you to see. You look at the Britannia Encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Britannica, under Christianity. And a great scholar from Yale University has written that article, it's not my article, in which he actually says that these days majority of Christians don't believe that they will be permanently in hell or heaven. In fact, he actually even says something I'm not entirely sure, but this is his remark, not my remark, that majority of them are now willing to believe in reincarnation, coming from the Theosophical Society or from the Indian tradition. So what I'm saying is that even within the modern Christian world, this is not being easily accepted. But that is the classical notion, which is why the emphasis on preserving the body even after death. Cremation, for example, cremation is completely forbidden, especially in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and even more strongly in Islam. Even if, let us say, if a Muslim friend of mine sees that now I'm being cremated, he's not allowed to come there. He'll be expelled. Very strong emphasis against cremation. Whereas in the Indian tradition, this is almost the standard idea. So these ideas, what I'm saying, have large influences in the culture. Uniqueness or oneness, etc. Which is the reason why we need to actually sometimes come together and see what are the differences in the cultures and what makes more and more sense to one. Now, especially about reincarnation, I have 10 more talks to give here. 4 of them will be focused on death, 4 on love, and then kind of a summary. And there I will try to also point out that reincarnation is now actually becoming acceptable even from a scientific point of view. This might surprise some of you. I'll speak about this. So many things arise, but once a religion sort of describes, in fact, a very well-known, actually he's a monk, Stendhal Rast, is a Christian monk. He actually said that the idea of purgatory more or less fills the same demand as reincarnation. That whatever crime you may have committed, you go to purgatory, you can now improve yourself. So from his point of view, that more or less does the same job as reincarnation. Now, whether it does or not, I don't know. I'm just telling you. So I think the notion of permanent hell and heaven is bothering more and more people. That's why you're raising this question yourself. So I don't think you'll be permanently in hell. Take my word for it.
I have a couple of questions. One is, how do you feel about the research into the earlier translations of the Bible that contained reincarnation and that contained passages from the Bhagavad Gita? And how do you feel about the Gnostic Gospels, the Gnostic scripture, and the similarity and the Indian traditions being involved?
Yes, I will speak a little bit about it at appropriate time.
Okay.
The idea of reincarnation was very much there in Christianity until the 6th century. It was Emperor Justin, sometimes called Justinian, who was the head of what we would now call Eastern Orthodox Church, but he was really head of the church. He's the one who even the Pope believed in reincarnation, the Pope at that time. But he imprisoned the Pope and forced him to declare this as heretical. I'll speak about this a little bit more detail.
And my second question is about the postures of Sri Ramana Maharishi. What you think that very different sort of the pictures of him being so different from Swami Vivekananda and the Sri Aurobindo.
That's what I said earlier also, that if somebody at his level, it doesn't matter how he sits or how he stands. The suggestion is, if I am a searcher, it is good for me to sit in meditation in proper posture. In fact, what I highly recommend some of my friends undertake meditation with me, what we really need is an attitude of prayer, but posture of meditation. Because posture of prayer actually interferes with breathing. You don't need to take my word for it, you should try. But on the other hand, when I say attitude of prayer, is really to say that I'm not trying to conquer something, I'm willing to receive something. And in meditation, then receptivity requires something from my side. Fundamentally, what it requires is a deeper and deeper relaxation. All our tensions, don't just take my word for it. I keep reminding people, I say many things, but don't just buy them. See if that is true for you. But in my judgment, all my tensions arise either out of fear or self-assertion. If I am deeply relaxed, it's always a cycle. Relaxation assists freedom from self-assertion and from fear, and freedom from self-assertion and freedom assists relaxation. So it's always a cyclical thing. And then one would realize that I can become more and more receptive. Traditionally, receptivity was associated with female and activity with male. Simply to do with the genitalia, really. There is nothing particular about it. But suggestion is, and you can see the classical image of Shiva, Ardha Narishwar, half male, half female, to bring both active energy and receptive energy in a proper coordination. Okay? This was just the beginning. I have many things to be brought. So we shall see each other tomorrow.